Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you are, and welcome to the Politics Guys with your hosts, Jay Carson and Michael Baranowski.
Welcome to the Politics Guys. I'm Michael Baranowski, a political scientist at Northern Kentucky University. My guest today is Dr. Daniel Drezner, a professor of international politics at the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy at Tufts University. Dr. Drezner is the author of multiple books, including Theories of International Politics and Zombies, The System Worked, How the World Stopped Another Great Depression, and, most recently, The Ideas Industry, How Pessimists, Partisans, and Plutocrats are Transforming the Marketplace of Ideas. Dr. Drezner's work has been published in numerous scholarly journals, as well as in the New York Times, Wall Street Journal, and Foreign Affairs. Dr. Drezner, welcome to the show.
Thank you very much. Happy to be here.
I'd like to start with your latest book, The Ideas Industry. In it, you argue that there's an important distinction between public intellectuals and thought leaders. And can you explain what that distinction is and why it matters?
Sure. So essentially, when I'm talking about public intellectuals and thought leaders, they're both intellectuals, and they often can both generate interesting insights. Essentially, the division sort of maps onto Isaiah Berlin's old essay called The Hedgehog and the Fox, in which Berlin talked about a fox knowing a little bit about a lot, whereas the hedgehog knows one big thing. So essentially, in my typology, public intellectuals are the foxes of the marketplace of ideas. They usually have some degree of expertise, without question, but they are often willing to opine about ideas or topics way beyond their original area of expertise, and they often know a little bit about it, to be fair. The key thing to realize about public intellectuals is that public intellectuals are critics. They can tell you everything that is wrong with everyone else's idea. On the other side, you have thought leaders. Thought leaders are evangelists. They have one big idea that they think can explain everything. And so as a result, any sort of question or any new problem that is thrown at a thought leader will usually find a way to somehow bring it back to whatever their original big idea is. So what I argue in the book is that a functioning marketplace of ideas needs both of these kinds of thinkers. If you have a marketplace of ideas dominated by public intellectuals, then the barriers to entry are too high, essentially, which means the marketplace becomes stagnant, becomes ossified. It becomes really hard for new ideas to sort of penetrate this market. On the other hand, a world in which thought leaders are dominant and public intellectuals are weaker is one in which the barriers to exit are too high. So as a result, you very often have a very wide-ranging, heterogeneous set of ideas, but the problem is that stupid ideas don't die. Essentially, one of the functions of public intellectuals is to critique ideas to within an inch of their lives. And a world in which public intellectuals are generally weaker is one that allows thought leaders to propose a whole variety of ideas without necessarily stress testing those ideas. And essentially, the book argues that there have been a couple of trends over the last few years that have essentially stacked the deck in favor of thought leaders at the expense of public intellectuals, which is why we are where we are now.
Because when you mentioned it, I immediately thought of one thing, and that's TED Talks, which seem to be everywhere now, or TED-style talks. And those folks, that would be an example, right, of thought leaders, certainly.
Right. I mean, I think public intellectuals can give TED Talks, but the TED Talk format is very well suited for a thought leader, because what they're generally trying to do is come up with an idea that, suggests we really need to totally rethink the way we're doing things. It's usually short, it's usually punchy, it's less than 20 minutes, and it always ends in a standing ovation. That is the classic thought leader mode.
And so it sounds like it's much more positive, certainly. And I'm wondering if maybe that's a big part of the attraction, why the deck has gotten stacked, is that people want some sort of a positive, simple, quick message and don't necessarily want to hear a lot of critique without any simple answers.
Right. This is an advantage that thought leaders have. Thought leaders generally are going to offer solutions in a way that public intellectuals are generally reluctant to. One of the things about a critic is that a critic can tell you everything that's wrong with everyone else's idea. They very often can't engage in their own sort of, notion of positive creation. Whereas a thought leader is very often offering an easy solution, or at least an appealing solution. And just in general, people are obviously more drawn to sort of a positive argument than they are to a negative critique. And they're also drawn to a more simple, not simplistic, but simple argument, as opposed to just someone saying it's complicated.
So do you feel that perhaps intellectuals or academics, I guess I would say, are not quite as well suited to be thought leaders? Because when I think of most of the academics I know, they're people who don't necessarily want to come up with simple, bold solutions. They kind of hem and haw on one hand, on the other hand. And when I think about thought leaders, that seems to be going very much against that. Do you think that works against sort of a prominent role for highly credentialed academics in this sort of area?
Right. So I made, part of the book got excerpted in the Chronicle of Education, and essentially that is the argument I made. I do think that it is possible for there to be academics who are thought leaders. Think about Jeffrey Sachs, talking about eradicating global poverty, or Neil Ferguson talking about Western civilization. They're both extremely impeccably credentialed academics, but they're also functioning as thought leaders. But I do think in general, academics are more likely when they engage in the marketplace of ideas to function as public intellectuals rather than as thought leaders. And in part, that's because of how we're trained. We're trained to believe that our ideas can be falsified and that there's always sort of nuance to some extent to what we're saying, or at least there's a limited empirical domain to something that we're explaining. So, in any academic article that you put forward, you will always have, usually some kind of hedging or emendation or amendment or, this sort of to be sure paragraph. And a thought leader sort of frees himself or herself from the shackles of those kinds of limits. And instead, confidence is one of the key weapons that a thought leader can apply in making cases to the marketplace of ideas. I don't know about your experience. I've been in seminars in the academy, also in more public venues, where I'm hearing someone making an argument, and I'm thinking to myself, this is just wrong. Mm-hmm. And then I think, but they seem so sure of themselves about it. They seem so utterly confident. And that in and of itself is attractive sometimes.
Right. Mother's Day is almost here, and the great way to show your appreciation for all Mom has done is with a beautiful bouquet from Pro Flowers. And really, it doesn't have to be Mom or Mother's Day. I mean, who doesn't love getting flowers? I got a bouquet from Pro Flowers not too long ago that really brightened up my morning. I liked it so much, I took a picture and posted it on the Politics Guys Twitter feed and Facebook page. You can take a look and see. I think you'll agree. Those are some really nice flowers. And here's a special deal. When you send the 100 Blooms for Mom bouquet from Pro Flowers this Mother's Day, you'll make a real impression because it comes with a free glass vase for just $19.99 plus shipping and handling. And if you really want to make a statement, you can upgrade to a premium vase and include gourmet chocolates for just $10 more. Choose the delivery date you want, and Pro Flowers are guaranteed to arrive fresh and beautiful and stay that way for at least 7 days or your money back. Now, the only way to get 100 Blooms for Mom with a free glass vase starting at $19.99 is to visit proflowers.com. You click on the microphone in the top right corner and use our code TPG. That's proflowers.com and code TPG when you click on the mic. This stunning bouquet sells out fast, they tell me, so you definitely want to order right away. As a social scientist, I guess it's been sort of gratifying for me to see a number of my fellow social scientists become much more influential than perhaps had been the case in the past. But I guess as a political scientist, I can't help but notice that a lot of these new thought leaders or public intellectuals, depending, seem to be disproportionately economists as opposed to people in my field. And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts as to why economists seem to be so big these days.
Why, I've written a whole chapter on this in the book. So yes, I do have some thoughts about it. I think there's a few things going on. One answer, which is specific to economics and political science, is that one of the advantages that economists have is that in some ways they have a common normative core, which is the principle of Pareto optimality or Pareto improvements. The idea that economists generally agree that if you can make someone else better off without making anyone else worse off, that's a worthwhile move to take because you're increasing efficiency. The problem that political scientists have is that we have a number of different competing normative interests and no real agreement as to how we should prioritize these things. So there's liberty, there's order, there's justice, there's democracy, there's security. These are all concepts that in political science we talk about and we talk about potentially promoting, but there's no agreement among us about which of these should have priority over the other, and nor should there be. It's a genuine genuinely contested set of ideas, but it means that it's harder for political scientists to have a sort of similar normative core than economists do. I think there are two other reasons, and these are sort of a larger part of the book that I'm talking about, the ideas industry, that help to explain why economists are generally listened to a little more than political science. One is that the increasing polarization of American society means that essentially you have people political elites drifting both to the further to the left and further to the right, and it becomes very easy for these ideological groups to stigmatize those on the other side as being sort of out of touch, either conservative bigots or out of touch lefties or so on and so forth. And one of the differences between economics and political science is that political scientists are almost uniformly on the left side of the political spectrum, whereas economists, although they are more liberal than most of American society, are generally considered to be the most moderate or have the most number of conservatives among the social sciences. And so as a result, the accusation against economists hits weaker than against political scientists. And then another reason, which I talk about in the book, is the sort of rise of wealth inequality and the rise of sort of a plutocratic class of sort of new philanthrocapitalists that are genuinely interested in ideas, but usually want to fund thinkers that essentially are putting forward worldviews that are consistent with their preconceived worldviews of how they got to where they got. So as a result, economists can sell a message to these people that political scientists can't. Economists like to talk about the idea of sort of the power of entrepreneurship, the power of individuals, guided by the invisible hand to pursue their self-interest, and so on and so forth. Political scientists, as a general rule, I mean, there are obviously exceptions, but political scientists, we like to make structural arguments. And so we are very often telling plutocrats that they got to where they got not because of their own initiative, but because of structural conditions. And shockingly enough, plutocrats don't like to hear that.
Yeah. I'm wondering if it's a concern that, given that economists seem to be so prominent, that people could start to see the world kind of through that one lens, because of course they approach the way they look at problems in a very different way and so forth. And I know I've seen some critiques on the left, especially saying that this might not be such a great thing if we try to look at every problem, every issue in society through the lens of economics.
Well, I mean, I don't want to bash the discipline too much. I certainly think economics has something to offer, but you can argue that certainly economics has sort of become the universal methodology of how intellectuals, talk about public policy in a way that the humanities might have been, let's say, 50 or 60 or 70 years ago. So yeah, I would obviously like to see political scientists listen to a little more, and even maybe, sociologists or anthropologists as well. I think the real problem we have is that essentially, I was struck by this. One of the things that motivated me to write the book was I was watching at one point Janet Yellen, who was the chairman of the Federal Reserve, testifying in front of Congress, and she was justifying a particular action that the Fed had taken by citing the economics literature on the subject. And it occurred to me that if, let's say, Rex Tillerson or Jim Mattis now were testifying in front of Congress and trying to explain why they were doing what they're doing, and reference the international relations literature or the political science literature, they would get laughed at by Congress. That wouldn't be taken seriously. And that I do find problematic. Yeah. At the same time, I think the fact that economics is so powerful also contravenes one of the criticisms that are sometimes lobbed at political science right now, which is that somehow political scientists are too, wedded to methodologies that are really hard to access, like formal modeling or randomized control trials or econometric techniques. Because if there's any discipline that's totally impenetrable to outsiders, it's economics.
Yeah.
And yet they have the greater influence.
When academics write in their disciplines, they have some sort of standard measures of influence, ranking of the journal, or the number of times an article is cited. And I'm wondering, how can we measure the influence, the importance of academics who are trying to make a difference in what some would call, the real world?
Well, there are obviously certain metrics one can use. We now, as someone who writes for a public audience, I can, tell you very specifically which articles get how many, online clicks and how many Twitter followers I have or how many Facebook followers I have. I would suggest, however, those are really dangerous metrics to rely upon. And I think in some ways, we one of the things that we started to talk about within the field is the question of things like citation counts. And I think that is absolutely a very useful metric, but it's hardly the be-all, end-all in terms of measuring someone's impact. Part of the reason, and you know this if you're in political science, is that very often someone might write an article that gets extremely widely cited, but it gets widely cited in the form of, I'm going to write this article in contrast to this idiot Drezner 2003 who made this dumbass argument, and if you get cited that way, I mean, yeah, you're having impact, I guess, but it's not exactly the best kind of impact. And I think one of the problems sometimes with the sort of public marketplace of ideas is that people can write provocative things that generate a lot of commentary about it, but it's not clear that it's actually useful, or it's not clear that it's necessarily a productive kind of conversation. So I would be wary of. I mean, there have been people who have made this argument. Rob Farley, for example, I think made an argument in PS a couple of years ago talking about blogging as a genuine form of scholarship. And I'm a little leery of that kind of trend. I'm not saying I don't want public engagement to be discouraged. I certainly want it to be encouraged, but I don't want it to be thought of as a vital part of being a scholar. I think being a scholar is what it is. If you want to engage with the public, that shouldn't be frowned upon. But I also am wary of having people who would be really bad at it trying to engage with the public as well.
Right. So why did you decide to sort of reach out beyond academia and write for a more general audience?
I mean, that was part of the reason I got a PhD in political science. I mean, I was always interested in policy relevant work. I mean, my dissertation was on economic sanctions because I thought it was both interesting theoretically, but I also thought it was obviously interesting from a policy perspective. So it never struck me that it was an either or kind of trade-off. But those are my predilections. So, that was why I started blogging back in 2002. And then, that eventually led to Foreign Policy and the Washington Post and a few other projects. It strikes me, it's almost for me kind of the hobby in relationship to the actual scholarship. And furthermore, I would actually argue, and I make this point in the book, I think a lot of people, when they talk about public engagement, very often assume that the way this should work is, well, first you do the serious scholarship and then you write the popular version of it. So maybe you write the scholarly piece in international security and then maybe the more popular version in foreign policy and then maybe an op-ed in the Wall Street Journal or what have you. I also think that it can work in reverse. I mean, for me, writing for the Washington Post, for example, as often as I do, very often those columns function as almost like an intellectual sketch pad for me. And they are written in the spirit of, hey, I could be wrong about this, but this is an interesting idea. And 9 times out of 10, the idea doesn't necessarily travel terribly well. But 1 time out of 10, maybe there's something there that's worth exploring further, either in a longer article or what have you. So, or a book. So there's peer-reviewed scholarship that I've written that started off as blog posts.
So do you think in general that modern thought leaders and public intellectuals matter the way they did in the past? Or am I even sort of right to assume that academics, that public intellectuals used to matter a significant amount in the past?
I don't think you're wrong about the latter point. I mean, there's no doubt that academics have had influence in the past. Indeed, at least in the case of the United States, the rise of the beginning of the post-war era, the rise of the Cold War, and in some ways government funding of research universities on a whole variety of disciplines in order to understand how the policy of anti-communism or containment should be pursued, certainly empowered academics to some degree. But I fight very hard against this sort of nostalgic argument that it was better before and that somehow public intellectuals are less powerful now. I think what's happened is that back in the day, what it was a much more cosseted marketplace. So there were certainly scholars like Hans Morgenthau or even public intellectuals like Walter Lippmann that genuinely had substantive influence on policymaking as well as having influence within the academy. I don't necessarily think that that's gone away. I think there are still people you can point to in the modern day like that. Think someone like Joe Nye, for example, or someone who's got a PhD but now writes for a wider audience, someone like Fareed Zakaria. I think the difference is that it's simply a bigger marketplace now than it used to be. And so I don't think that it's a case where there might be fewer giants, but that's also because there are more people. And that said, I do think this sort of superstar economics that operates in today's marketplace of ideas does mean that there are certain people that exercise, sort of outsized influence. It's just that some of them aren't academics.
Right. Some of those people who exercise that outsized influence, some would say that it's because they're the flashiest or the most controversial, the best self-promoters. And there's, I think, a concern that we should do something to improve the quality of intellectual discourse. And I'm wondering if there's even a way to do that, or if there's anything in particular that academics can do who are maybe interested in reaching a wider audience, but don't feel like they want to become, very sensationalistic necessarily.
Well, I would first start by pointing out that, self-promotion is a long and distinguished tradition in the academy. So this is hardly unique to the modern era. What might be different in the modern era is that we can observe the self-promotion in a way that we couldn't have before. So, again, speaking in terms of foreign policy, which is the area I know best, if you were trying to self-promote, let's say back in even 20 years ago, you would have done so by, let's say, trying to write up or publish op-eds in the New York Times or the Washington Post or the Financial Times or publish in Foreign Affairs or so on and so forth. There were only so many, venues that really attracted all that much attention. We're now operating in a world where there's so much social media and so many different media outlets out there that it becomes easier to observe people trying desperately to sort of capture attention, trying to engage in self-promotion. But I think self-promotion that's a constant in the way that intellectuals have occasionally tried to market their wares. In terms of improving the quality of intellectual discourse, I talk about this in the conclusion somewhat, I think there are a couple of things that can be done. One is that, the sort of traditional sources of funding for intellectuals, places like the sort of traditional mainline foundations, should stop getting obsessed with impact. One of the problems that you've seen in recent years is that both universities and foundations have been obsessed with this notion of impact of ideas upon the real world, whether in terms of media mentions or pointing at concrete changes in policy or so on and so forth. And it's not that I think all of these metrics are awful. It's that there are times where you want to fund intellectual development and there's not going to be any short-term payoff from it. And so I think a greater degree of patience would be a better idea in that sense. The second thing that I think can be done is to generally just sort of reward greater diversity on a whole variety of different dimensions, but in terms of those intellectuals who are entering the marketplace, whether we're talking about gender or race or even political orientation. Not so much because I necessarily think they will produce better ideas, but rather more heterogeneity in this sense sort of cuts against the kind of superstar phenomena that I talked about before. And I guess the last way, and this would be something that would be laughed out of existence if I talked about any other sector, but I do think applies to intellectuals, is a greater sense of self-control, which is to say that, you don't necessarily have to say yes to every writing opportunity or every speaking opportunity. Because if there is one sort of group within the United States that should not necessarily automatically respond to material rewards, it should be intellectuals. And so the idea of, learning to have some sort of sustainable public profile rather than trying to say yes to everything and becoming an intellectual brand, I think is an admirable goal to pursue.
Yeah, I'd like to shift gears just for a little bit and talk about current politics, kind of tap into your expertise in international relations. In terms of President Trump's foreign policy, do you think that he fits into any of sort of the standard categories that we think about, or is he, in your view, kind of a complete original?
He is sui generis. In some ways, he does fit into the mold of a populist in the sense that, he is anti-elite and anti-pluralist, and that his definition of the sort of the people is in some ways exclusionary. That doesn't necessarily translate well into foreign affairs. I think the better way to think about the thing that makes Trump genuinely unique, and this can't be stressed enough, is the degree of radical ignorance that Trump has about world politics. And it's come through in the fact that he's reversed course on any one of a number of different policies, whether it's talking about NATO being obsolete or whether China is a currency manipulator or whether the U.S. Embassy is going to move to Jerusalem or what have you. And essentially, he's almost being forced to recognize that the world is a far more complicated place than what he said during the campaign. And it even, to a limited extent, that came across in that, gonzo AP interview that he gave last week, in which that he said he had no idea that the federal government was so big. So in some ways, the way that makes Trump unique is not necessarily that he has a philosophy. He does have a few core elements of that philosophy, and that he seems to have two core principles. First, this belief that somehow the current rules of the game are stacked against the United States, which is not something that realists or liberals or even constructivists would necessarily believe. And second, that he thinks that economics is a zero-sum game, which is almost an outmoded form of thought among American foreign policy circles. So in that sense, yeah, he's definitely unique.
You mentioned his sort of lack of background in international politics or domestic politics, really. And it seems to me, and a lot of folks have commented, it seems to be coupled with a lack of interest in actually learning on the job, as it were, which would make it even more dangerous, one would think.
No, that's correct. I mean, in some ways, what makes Trump unique, lots of presidents, don't necessarily have a ton of foreign policy experience. But one thing you can say about, people as diverse as Barack Obama and George W. Bush and Bill Clinton was that they, A, knew this was an important topic, and B, knew they needed to study it. They had some metacognition, which is to say they knew what they didn't know. Trump has no metacognition whatsoever. He has no idea what he doesn't know.
Right. In one of your more recent Washington Post columns, it was an article entitled "Trump Fought the Blob and the Blob Won." So what blob was he fighting, and has enough time passed to say that the blob has definitely beaten him?
Right. So the blob is a term that Ben Rhodes, who was the director of strategic communications for the National Security Council under Barack Obama, coined in an interview the New York Times Magazine last year. And by the blob, he was referring derisively to sort of this think tank industrial complex inside Washington of basically foreign policy community watchers who were advocating more forceful action in Syria and believe in notions like resolve and credibility mattering and so on and so forth. And you can argue that if Trump did run, whenever Trump did talk about foreign policy during the campaign, this was an area where Trump actually shared something in common with Barack Obama, which is they both disdained the blob in some ways. And, the point I made in that blog post was that, particularly about 2 weeks ago, Trump seemed to reverse course on one of like 6 different issues in terms of campaign promises versus what he was actually doing. And what he was actually doing was suggesting some continuity with previous foreign policy presidents. Do I think this is a permanent victory? No. In fact, that was the point I made in the blog post, which is that I thought this was temporary. That essentially Trump will do whatever he can to somehow, because he craves popularity and craves adulation, it would not shock me if he takes actions that the foreign policy community likes, because that means he can actually get praised. One of the interesting things and one of the more disturbing things about the Syria strikes, for example, was the degree to which a fair number of foreign policy watchers praised Trump for taking action there. And it suggests that might be what he's inclined to do later.
Right. Now, in another one of your recent articles, you talk about Donald Trump's tweets. And, of course, his supporters often say that he should be taken seriously, but not literally, especially on Twitter. And I'm wondering if you agree with that, and also kind of more generally how you've come to understand President Trump's use of Twitter.
Right. So I think, bluntly, that's a load of crap. I understand the argument, which is to say that folks like the Heritage Foundation's James Carafano have made the case of, look, not all of Trump's words should be treated equally. A tweet is one thing, a State of the Union address is another, and I think that's certainly a fair point. The problem comes when, to some extent, it's not just the domestic audience that is paying attention to what Trump says in these things, it's also the international audience. And if Trump says something particularly provocative and enrages a foreign population, like let's say if he says in an interview casually that China, that Korea used to be part of China, well, guess what? That's going to annoy the Korean population. And so that actually has real world effects, so that even if Trump wasn't taking it seriously, the audience will take it seriously. So, to have Trump's defenders go to South Korea and say, no, you need to take him seriously, but not literally, I don't know if that's going to work. But in some ways, the other problem is that even if it does work, the problem is that it devalues all of presidential rhetoric. So if you're basically told, look, Trump's just popping off, you should pay no attention to that, the question then obviously arises, well, then when should you take Trump's words literally? if you could discount what he's saying, if you could discount, threats that Iran is being put on notice, for example, then if he actually does issue a credible threat, how do you know that he's actually going to follow through on it? We saw this, by the way, with the dispatch of the Carl Vinson, that carrier group, the fact that they said it was going steaming up north, and then as it turned out, it wasn't. So that undercuts his credibility as well. So I think the problem is that presidents before Trump recognized that when they said something in public, the words mattered. I think the problem with Trump is that he doesn't think the words matter all that much. He's not necessarily all that precise. And maybe in some areas you can say, well, that's because we should take him seriously, but not literally. But, if other actors in the world take him seriously and literally, then we have to as well.
Right. You kind of indirectly mentioned the North Korea situation with the Vincent and so forth. And it seems to me, it seems to a lot of people, that there's a really good chance that the North Korea situation may sort of come to a head during Donald Trump's presidency. And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on how you think this could perhaps play out.
It says something that I think in some ways the best case scenario is essentially a continuation of the status quo. I've written before that there are ways in which the North Korean crisis has a certain stability to it, of all things, in that, North Korea continues to launch nuclear tests. We continue to ratchet up sanctions against North Korea. North Korea continues not to care about this. China continues to urge dialogue, impose some degree of sanctions, but nonetheless doesn't want the North Korean regime to disappear. And then we continue on to the next year. There are ways in which this is still going to be the case, because it's going to be a couple of years at least before North Korea develops the kind of missile technology that would really genuinely represent a threat to the United States. But even so, even if North Korea gets to that stage, my hunch is that even that's not that big of a threat. So it's not obvious to me that precipitous action will be taken.
So you don't think necessarily then that President Trump's suggestion he's willing to go easier on trade for Chinese cooperation with North Korea will yield any sort of significant results then?
I think that's ludicrous on several levels, but the most obvious one is that it's not obvious. As I said, China's strategic interests have been very clear for the last 20 years now, which is China doesn't want North Korea to proliferate, but they also don't want North Korea to disappear. They want a North Korean buffer between South Korea and the Chinese mainland. And they also don't want the North Korean state to disintegrate, because that would lead to waves of refugee flows. So as a result, China is exasperated by what North Korea does. I'm sure they would prefer North Korea be a more pliant client state. But the simple fact is that they will live with the status quo.
And just one final question I have for you, and I think it's especially, appropriate question for you given your last book on public intellectuals and thought leaders. What sort of writers or books or other resources would you recommend to people, sort of the highest quality that you think is out there for public intellectuals, thought leaders, for people who are interested in having a better understanding, a deeper understanding of politics and international relations than what they might be likely to get just sort of randomly surfing?
That's a tough question. There's a couple of books I'm reading now that I'm finding very engaging and that I would recommend, to others. One is a book that I'm just wrapping up by Brian Bew called Realpolitik: A History, which is an outstanding sort of intellectual history of the very idea of realpolitik, not realism, but realpolitik, and the ways in which, in fact, it is somewhat distinct from realism. And I enjoyed that. I've enjoyed that immensely and learned a lot from it. There's another book that came out about 2 months before mine by Tom Nichols, who's a professor at the Naval War College, called The Death of Expertise. And in some ways, it's a good antecedent to my book. And it points to one of the causes of the shift in marketplace of ideas, which is the erosion of trust and authority and expertise. And I certainly think that would be worth reading. There's two books that I'm reading now that I'm enjoying, not by political scientists. One is by Pankaj Mishra, called The Age of Anger, I think. Mishra is just sort of a full-blown public intellectual, and I'm a particularly big fan of his previous book, From the Ruins of Empire. I'm actually less Mishra's book, ironically, is succeeding in making me angry because I think I disagree with it some. But that said, I like a book that gets me that exercise, so I'm still continuing to read it. And then the final book, which I've been recommending to everyone because I think it's a great argument and also deals with sort of ways in which we argue is by Phoebe Maltz-Bovey, and it's called The Perils of Privilege. And it's basically about the sort of dangers or hazards of engaging in kind of debates about privilege in public discourse, and why it's not necessarily a fruitful line of inquiry.
Well, okay, that's a great reading list. I think I'm going to head right on over to Amazon and add some to my wish list there. Thank you for that. And with that, we will close. Dr. Daniel Drezner, thanks so much for taking the time to talk with me today.
Thanks a lot. This was a lot of fun.
That's it for this Politics Guys interview. Thanks for listening. If you've got a question, comment, correction, or just a random thought you want to share, you can reach us at mail@politicsguys.com. Our Facebook page, where you can message us and where we post throughout the week, is facebook.com/politicsguys page. We're also on Twitter @politicsguys. You know, we really appreciate our great listeners who have so generously supported the show through their donations. If you'd like to join them, you can do that through the Patreon or PayPal links on our website, politicsguys.com. And if money's tight or you're already a financial supporter, please consider hitting that share icon on your podcast app to pass this episode along to your friends and followers. Leaving ratings and reviews of the show on your app and sharing and retweeting our new show posts and tweets also helps to spread the word, which helps to bring in new listeners, leading to the donations and advertisers that make it possible for us to keep on bringing you the Politics Guys. And finally, thanks to today's sponsor, proflowers.com, where you can get 100 Blooms for Mom bouquet and a free glass vase starting at $19.99 by going to proflowers.com, clicking on the microphone in the top right corner, and using our code TPG. That's proflowers.com and code TPG when you click on the mic. We'll be back with a new interview next Wednesday. We hope you'll join us.